So that takes me to the final element of my third theme, which it deals with missing records. In some circumstances, individuals and hospital trusts and health boards have not been able to ascertain what happened to missing medical records. For example, the inquiries received a statement from a man who underwent a combined septoplasty and rhinoplasty on the 17th of August 1987 at the Queen Mary's Hospital in Roehampton. He has confirmation of his admission to and discharge from the hospital. He attempted to obtain a complete set of his medical records, but ultimately he received a letter back from the hospital which stated that after an extensive search they simply couldn't find his records. A woman with severe von Willebrand's disease, treated in Manchester and Birmingham, diagnosed with hepatitis C in St Thomas's Hospital. She tried to get copies of her notes from her Manchester for her entire childhood. She says this, however, having said yes, no problem, leave it with me, the specialist nurse then rang us back to say my notes had gone down a black hole and she couldn't understand it. Other witnesses have raised concerns about the existence of gaps in their medical records relating to specific appointments or procedures, and that has caused particular concern that their records have been purposefully tampered with or key records removed. Again, investigations into that have been extremely difficult. There are examples in the written presentation dealing with some of those examples. I will just highlight two. A man who was co-infected with HIV and hepatitis C was informed of his diagnosis with HIV in 1985 via a letter. He's kept a copy of that letter. But in his witness statement, he says, interestingly, I've been unable to locate a copy of the letter in the medical records that have been provided to me. A woman has provided a statement concerning her husband, who was infected with HIV and hepatitis C as part of treatment for severe haemophilia at the Royal Free Hospital. She's described that there's no reference of her husband's attendances at the hospital in February 1985 when he received his diagnosis of HIV. And the witness says these records must have been removed from his notes. There's nothing contained within the medical records between the 24th of September 1984 to 8th of March 1985. There are further examples in the written presentation dealing with records of specific appointments being missing or specific years being missing from the records. One example is of a witness with severe haemophilia who was treated at the Newcastle Haemophilia Centre and states that he has no records from the beginning of 1985 to the end of 1986, and he was first alerted to it by US lawyers in the litigation that followed. The inquiry has not been able to undertake substantial investigations into all of these situations. It's just to highlight that we have a very significant body of evidence from those infected and affected, highlighting gaps in the records, but there's not much more, sir, that I can say beyond that. That, though, does take me to my final theme, which is significant interference in medical records. The inquiry has received some accounts from infected individuals and their affected family members that raise serious issues of intentional interference in medical records. And in that sense, sir, it's something that goes beyond a missing record or a missing set of years, if I can put it that way. The inquiry tried to identify statements where there was something more that needed to be looked at, more substantially perhaps. In this section of the presentation, I'll set out the available evidence and the investigations undertaken by the inquiry. An affected mother provided written and, sir, you'll recall her oral evidence to the inquiry about her son's infection with hepatitis C and his death in 2012. Her son was initially treated at Great Ormond Street from 1976, and he first received factor VIII on the 3rd of November 1980 due to a lack of availability of cryoprecipitate, notwithstanding his parents' expressed concerns about the safety of American blood products. In 1985, his care moved to the Royal Free Hospital. His mother gives the following account. We returned to Great Ormond Street the same day, but they refused to give us the file with her son's medical notes. I don't remember who it was at Gosh that refused to hand over his records. However, about 2 weeks later, a nurse from Great Ormond Street rang me at work and said if we'd like to meet her, she'd give me the file. She met us in the street. Although I recognised her at the time, I can't remember her name now. I took the medical records to the Royal Free. I thought they were complete. I couldn't have known for sure. I don't remember looking through them until we got to the Royal Free, as I thought it was the right thing to do. We looked at the notes with the head nurse of the haemophilia department at the Royal Free, whose name was Christine Harrington. There was a dated page with tram lines scrawled across, within which was written in large letters, "Neurotic Mother." I recognised that this entry was from the day I kicked up such a fuss about refusing to allow Nick to be given American Factor 8 in early 1980. After her son died, she applied for his medical records, but the neurotic mother note was missing. She says she rues to this day that she wasn't savvy and didn't photocopy the notes. The inquiry obtained a statement from Deborah Pollard, lead nurse specialist within the Haemophilia and Thrombosis Centre at Royal Free, in response to treatment matters. It also received a statement from Dr. Eleanor Goldman, Professor Graham Foster, and 2 statements from Professor Christine Lee. None of these statements assist as to the circumstances in which this reference in his medical records was removed. A response is awaited from Great Ormond Street itself. Another example of a specific item being removed from a patient's medical records is provided by a man infected with hepatitis B and hepatitis C as a result of treatment for his severe haemophilia A. He was treated at the Royal United Hospital in Bath with Factor 8 from the late 1970s. He states that his mother kept meticulous home treatment records. He states that the records he received from the Bath Hospital are generally comprehensive. However, the man recalls attending an appointment in the 1990s and reading a letter from a pharmaceutical company offering to donate money to the hospital charity if their product was used. He says, "It was clearly on display in my file, and I remember reading it upside down across the desk during a clinic review." However, when he received his records, he was unable to find that specific letter. The inquiries obtained a statement from the Royal United Hospital, which confirms that the Trust has been unable to find a copy of this letter in the witness's medical records. The inquiry has not been able to establish any further details as to the circumstances of this letter. The inquiry has also received a statement from a woman who had a blood transfusion on the 23rd of May 1986. She states she was told by the ward sister that she needed to have a transfusion in the early stages of labour due to anaemia. She recalls she had a cannula inserted and she was hooked up to blood and the transfusion was started. Her recollection is that the transfusion was then stopped by a nurse before it was finished and she was told to go for an ultrasound. She was diagnosed with hepatitis C in 2016. And she says this about her medical records: "There are no records for the day of my transfusion, the 23rd of May. There are doctor's notes for the 19th, 20th, 21st, 22nd of May, and then for the 24th of May until I was discharged. There are no nursing notes for any part of the admission. There is nothing in my records which confirms that I had a blood transfusion on the 23rd of May or that I had an ultrasound on that day." The witness made a complaint to the Trust. During her oral evidence to the inquiry in 2019, she explained that she actually went up to the hospital in person and asked them to bring somebody down from the office so that she could hand them her complaint letter, and all of a sudden they instantly found everything except for the notes. She says, "It took all in all about 10 months from initial request for them to supply me with notes that they said they'd got and a letter to say that they thought that due to the timescale and building moves that any letters from that time, except for the ones that I got either side of that, had been destroyed or lost, and they've never come up with the day of the 23rd. In a letter dated September 2017, the Trust stated that a thorough search and investigation was undertaken to try and find any additional and or secondary filing which may contain information in respect of a blood transfusion in May 1986. No such documents were found. The letter states that following the witness's complaint, another search was done to ensure every avenue had been explored. However, that second search didn't find any further records or information. The reason given by the Trust was that any secondary filing or documentation which may have existed relating to your admission some 32 years ago has almost certainly been destroyed due to the length of time which has now passed. In the written presentation, there's then a further example from oral evidence as well in relation to a man who was treated at the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary where records were, he indicated in his oral evidence he was told his records were being destroyed. And the final, and that's set out in full, so in the written presentation. Finally, several patients treated by Professor Ludlam have raised concerns that Professor Ludlam kept a separate file regarding patients' HIV infections. In relation to the question of keeping separate files on haemophilia patients with HIV, Professor Ludlam's evidence is that for those patients who were anti-HTLV3 positive, I kept short thumbnail sketches of pertinent clinical information along with laboratory findings. I kept a small number of notes, no more than a single sheet of paper for each patient, separate from the main hospital case records in relation to people with haemophilia who came to see me early in 1985. And it indicates that the notes were kept separate because as a team, there had been a decision that they wouldn't make any record related to HTLV3 or AIDS in the patient notes. So inevitably, in this presentation, we can only identify a certain number of the infection affected statements, but Sarah, I'm very conscious that you have read and are reading all of them, as are the team here. And so it may be that over time, further examples of significant interference are identified and explored, but at this stage, that's the work that has been done on missing and destroyed records. As I said at the beginning, there is also obviously the full written presentation which has been published.
Yes. Yes, well, thank you very much. So that then concludes the work of the inquiry in session today, does it?
It does, sir, yes.
So tomorrow morning?
Tomorrow morning, I hope to outline just for 5 minutes a couple of other matters in relation to some witness statements and some schedules of documents that will by then have been disclosed. And thereafter, we'll be hearing from Caroline Flint.
Very well. So tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock tomorrow.